bolts, etc. And we as a group of people were able to build 3D printers. Smart tools that were very accessible. Well, that same 3-axis control system is also used in mills. So a computer-controlled mill can go ahead and remove material very precisely. And now they're also very cheap and very powerful. Laser cutters came along. They're nothing more than 2 axes. You just move along the XY plane and you cut. So all of a sudden these tools became expensive. These tools became powerful and available to people. And that open source software philosophy of sharing things is now being included in the hardware world. So you can share designs. So I was mentioning you could download models and print something on your 3D printer that somebody else designed. Or, in my case, for instance, I recently downloaded a business card holder, but my cards happen to be in the portrait mode instead of the landscape mode that it was designed for. So I just put it into my software, which was low cost, in my case, free, and I redesigned it, I tweaked it. So I was able to take someone else's design, I was able to modify it, and then I was able to use my 3D printer to crank out something of my own. This is something that is relatively new, and it's kind of a big part of the fuel in what's happening with what we call the maker movement. It's a grandiose name for the fact that people are getting back into making. The other thing that's happening is that these electronics are so inexpensive that there are boards that people love. One, for instance, is called the Arduino. Anybody here heard of the Arduino? Great, right? Right now there's an $8 one, an $8 Arduino from a group called Adafruit. And it's a simple processor. It's not multitasking, it's got very little RAM, but you can put sensors and actuators up to it until the cows come home, and you don't have to be a coding expert, someone really good with software to make it happen, because it's, again, open source. So if you want to be able to control a sensor, let's say a vibration sensor or a GPS, or you want to be able to control an actuator like a motor or an LED, you just download this code, and all of a sudden people can do things with hardware that they haven't been able to do for decades because it got too expensive to innovate on hardware. It's now possible. Now this all became apparent to me because I was a manufacturing engineer undergraduate. I probably graduated and never touched my engineering background, and I found myself in 2010 in the Bay Area. I was just finishing up a trip. I was chair of a small business incubator out in Virginia, in Reston, Virginia, and we just weren't making much of a difference in the local economy. It was kind of ho-hum. And I was thinking, okay, this is cool. I can do this, or we can do something to really improve that. So I visited a bunch of incubators around the country. I happened to be in the Bay Area on the weekend of MakerFaire. And I thought, okay, what the heck? I'll go to MakerFaire because I've heard of it. I subscribed to the magazine. And what I saw there kind of blew me away. We had kids messing with robots that could do things I had no idea kids could do. I came across people who were working with 3D printers of their own design and doing amazing things. And people were working with quadcopters, they were doing things with radio, and they were doing things with even some more basic making, because making has been around forever, right? I mean, it's kind of funny to be talking about a maker movement, as long as they're the tools, people that they're making. And so it's a little bit funny to be talking about something that's so fundamental to life, but if you recognize the fact that we didn't do a lot of it for a long time, and that the advent of the sharing philosophy that comes along with open source, the low-cost electronics, and the fact that we've kind of come to realize that making is important to education. There's an awful lot that's happening. And one of the metrics of how much is happening is these fairs. So I went to that Maker Faire in the Bay Area, and I came away with being sort of impacted by it. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was so much that was possible. So many people were doing so many great things. And based on my undergraduate, 25 years previous, this shouldn't have been possible. How are these people doing all this? It was so impressive to me. So I set out trying to figure out what was going on. And one of the things that was sort of the end of my journey was moving to San Diego about 2 years ago and wanting to get involved in trying to make making happen more in San Diego. And so let's go ahead and just talk a little bit more about MakerFaire itself. And to do that, there's this cute little video that I happen to really like that can serve as a little sense of what it's like. You get to see what's going on in this one fair in the Bay Area.
People ask what MakerFaire is. I say you really have to come and experience it. It's much bigger, bolder, beautiful than you can imagine.
MakerFaire is a newfangled county fair, so it's rockets and robots, and it's a fair for the people and for our time.
The stuff that people make and they show at MakerFaire is just incredible. This is the place that it's cool to be smart, you know?
It's cool to be smart.
MakerFaire is this huge tapestry of creativity. I love just wandering around and looking at all the different things. People spend hours and hours interacting with makers and seeing really a spectacle of making. But at its heart, I think it's a conversation with people who create things and make things and produce something for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's a hobby, sometimes it's a business. But they're here sharing what they do, and it's just a wonderful, incredible event that I think makes you see that this is sort of the best side of human beings.
As we went through that, you saw everything from some steampunk submarine that was going across the land to kids learning how to drive a nail because they've never used a hammer before. I mean, there were grandparents, there were children, there was a whole spectrum there. This is a very family-oriented event. It tends to be like 60 to 70% are multi-generational families that come to this. And it's an opportunity to interact with this stuff. It's not just to go and see a booth. Almost everything we do when we bring in these makers to exhibit what they're proud of is to have them show you what they've done, allow you to maybe mess with what they've done, maybe even have a making exercise. But that is just a little sense of what MakerFaire is like. Let's go back to my presentation here and go back to full screen. So when I moved here, I had to spend 2+ years running around the United States, Canada, and the UK, visiting what are called maker spaces. Maker spaces are these kind of groups of people who get together. I mean, if this club had a shack that you guys got together in regularly, and you had projects that you were doing ongoing, that would be just like most maker spaces. Maker spaces are a bunch of people get together and they say, we have a room, let's find the right tools, let's teach each other, let's do projects. These are maker spaces. We have a few of them in the county. But San Diego, being the 8th largest city in the country, didn't have much compared to what I had seen in so much of the rest of the country. And my sense was that maybe what was happening was that all this making was going on, it just hadn't been outed. And one of the things that we realized, I guess it was in New York, was that maker fairs are really great for bringing out all different types of makers and having them all show what they're up to and putting that on display for the rest of the world to see. And so it's a brand that a lot of people recognize. It's a brand with a process around it, such as how do you deliver these things. And so knowing Maker Media folks as I do and having been to enough fairs, I went with a small group of people. We developed the program, and this is what we had planned for the venue. This is the, in the Del Mar Fairgrounds, this is the Bing Crosby Hall. And this is the big parking lot outside. This group had 90 feet of booth space that was going to be there. There was a tower, there was emergency services, there were all sorts of things that were planned. Unfortunately, as you see in red here, I was told it never happened here. I didn't plan for rain. What was this rain thing? Well, I think it was probably the biggest downpour of rain that was the biggest rain since today, up until today. There hasn't been more rain since then. And so we had to do a quick adjustment, just as I did right now by pushing my button to bring this back up. Quick adjustment to really change things, because we had so many big events over here. We had a 25 by 25 foot robot competition where they would shoot frisbees at targets. We had all sorts of activities out here where people could make little, what are called marshmallow shooters. We just pre-cut PVC and marshmallows. We allowed kids to come together and make these marshmallow shooters, and then they had target practice with them. Things like air rockets, where you take a piece of paper, you fold it a particular way, following some instructions, you put it on PVC, you pump up 15 pounds of air pressure, and you shoot these rockets up into the sky a few hundred feet. Kids love this stuff. Big kids love this stuff. Okay? This is a lot of fun, getting your hands into all these things. But we ended up having to do a quick readjustment. In the last 48 hours, we relayed the whole thing out. And unfortunately, we didn't have a few groups, and Palomar was one of the groups that didn't make it inside because we were so tight. So this is the Bing Crosby Hall, and you can see from the coding up here that this thing was laid out a particular way. The way I laid this out was people would tend to come in here because the path was this way, and I kind of went from high tech to lower tech. And so over here we had a quadcopter flying cage. It's a 40 by 20 foot cage with mesh over it. We had all sorts of quadcopter exhibitions and competitions, that sort of thing. We had 3D printing. We had different types of computer controlled tools. Lots of schools. We had high schools. We had elementary schools. We had 3 universities, but not in a professorial, I'm here to teach you about electronics and show you about my engineering program. No, this was all, and you'll see in a minute, people who were excited about projects they were working on. And there's this one guy who had a robot that sort of, it hung from a wire, and it was like a power cable. And this robot would flip and flip, and it would move along power cables for miles, all the while it was measuring for any excess radiation, extra power that should have been emitting, whatever, and it gathered that data. And it was a project it was doing at UCSD, but it was just a fabulous little monkey device that was based on Arduino and had some real practical business value to it. And yet it was so much fun for kids to be able to see that thing going to and fro. Came along through here, we had some people like Qualcomm. Qualcomm is invested in a variety of startups. And they wanted to have a showcase for some of the startups, but they were all like little robots that play games and people can code them and hands-on. This is my point. A MakerFaire is not a go look at something. A MakerFaire is a go and experience something, make something, learn something new. And then we also, in this corner over here, had a series of speakers all day long, just all sorts of things. But rather than just show you this, I'd like to just take you to a variety of pictures so you can just get a feel for what it is that we had. So this is about 4/5 of the hall. So this is taken from about where that speaking area was. And a little bit dark. It wasn't that dark when we were there, but you can see that the place is just full of pipe and drape. Which, by the way, I didn't know what pipe and drape was until I did this. I'm not in any way, shape, or form a professional producer of events, but I just cared enough about this and wanted to see if we could make it happen here. So I went ahead and did it. The rain was coming down in buckets. It was just an incredible day. And yet, we were packed to the gills with people. There were people, 150 people long, in line outside in the rain, trying to get tickets. We had people from our volunteer crew going up and saying, you don't have to stand in line. You can buy your ticket on your cell phone and go in. But for some reason, they just liked the experience of standing in line. They just like the Apple experience. I don't know. But they were there in droves. Here's an example of making an activity. There are maker spaces that are like informal groups where just a bunch of friends get together with tools and do things. And then there are some businesses. Like for instance, there's a group in town called Maker Place. Maker Place is at like where the 5 and the 8 cross. It's on Lorena Boulevard. They had an interest in coming here because they teach people how to use tools, and they have lots of tools that people can use. It's kind of like a health club, but instead of exercise equipment, you get to use their tools. Their mills, their lathes, their 3D printers, that sort of thing. There's also another one right up here in Vista. It is in Vista. What was it?
It's on Progress Avenue. It's near like Linda Vista. It's on the edge of San Marcos.
Linda Vista. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's called Open Source Maker Labs. You just had an opening weekend last weekend, so I figured I'd mention it to you. But this is the kind of thing that you would do in a booth. Here's somebody instructing a kid how to solder. A quick side note, we've done a lot of things since that, and I'll mention one of them in a minute, but we had an event at the Fleet Science Center in Balboa Park, and we had Girl Scouts who we've been training how to train others to solder. And I have this 7 or 8-year-old girl who's sitting there across from a man who was 84 being taught how to solder. And this man felt such a sense of accomplishment. It was this 7 or 8-year-old girl who was teaching him how to solder. Just amazing, just amazing. Here we have some kids who have done some solder projects. This is a pretty typical solder project. You can't tell from right here, but maybe remember my opening slide, there was this red robot. Well, this is an 11 solder joint project, and it has basically a button battery on the back, 2 LEDs, and people will solder this together, solder the pin on, and then walk around, and just feel this incredible sense of pride. I mean, you remember what it's like. Every time you finish a project and somebody can see you did something, and you saw your handiwork out there for people to see, that's what these kids are feeling. Here's a marshmallow shooter. You can see the PVC cut and assembled, and here's what they do with it. We had to limit, it was so tight, we just had a little target practice. Then we're putting marshmallows in and shooting it into a bucket. There are actually many more things that people do when they have more room. This is something called Nerdy Derby. Now, you guys probably, those of you who were Boy Scouts once upon a time, I think it's Cub Scouts who did this. Remember the Pinewood Derby?
Yeah.
Okay. Now you remember Pinewood Derby has a whole bunch of rules, right? Yeah. Weight, materials. Nerdy Derby, no rules. Okay? You're given a block of wood, and you go ahead and you assemble it. We pre-drilled some holes. We have the screws. We have the washers we use for wheels. But then there's to make it their own. And so we have kids making things. They have slightly older kids. You're getting the impression that it's all small kids. That's the way I start this presentation out. And they decorate it up any way they like, and then they test it out on a trial track. And this is where all the excitement is. There's a person there, takes 2 cars and races them one against another. And it's a time trial, and they get to see how they perform against somebody else and whether they win the race or not. And it took me 4 or 5 events before I finally did one of these. I'll tell you, it's not easy to win these things. I had little kids kicking my butt. It was embarrassing. Here's another little project that people do. Again, people are making these things. So they come in and they're actually sitting down at a table working on it. This is called a brush pot. It's way overstatement for what it is. It's nothing more than a cell phone. The vibrator that you have on our cell phones called silent mode. So it's just one of those vibrators on the head of a toothbrush with a battery. And so you make it, and it just sits there and vibrates, sit it on the table, and it moves. But what we do is we turn it into a little racetrack. So you put yourself in the beginning, and it just randomly maybe advances or doesn't advance. You really have no say whether you're going to win this race or not, okay? But that's one of the projects that they do. LED throws. I don't know what it is. You put an LED in front of just about anybody and they get excited about the project. I don't know. I really don't know what it is. So here we have these, you take a button battery, LED, and earth magnet, very, very strong magnet, put a tape around it, and you can toss it and use target practice. You can see exactly where you landed, and there have been sort of different things that people have done. There was a time when people were throwing up under a bridge. It was just an art project. People were throwing them all up under a brick that sticks to whatever metal is thrown up there. Just an example of the kind of making program. This is called a, I don't know what the word's called. Basically, it's a spirograph type thing. Uses a vibrating, a lopsided motor on it, so it sort of moves the thing randomly. It has pens on it, so it draws. But the kids assemble these things. This is something that takes your face and morphs it into some famous character. Now, this is where we're starting to see more explicit educational things to it. This right here is an example of a vendor. We have a few vendors. Most of us don't like to have vendors at these events because it's sort of, we're not there to sell so much, but when it's a big making project, and this guy, all of his stuff is made out of cardboard. And so it's a great family project. You can get these things and then you go home and the kid and the parents can sit around and they can make swords and helmets and it becomes called crafty, but it's just a great. And none of these things are complete without plenty of Star Wars, the 501st, any kind of cosplay, because you recognize the incredible work these people put into their costumes. I mean, this is really serious making. I can't begin to do what some of these people do with their costumes. And I think you'll see in a second, especially the steampunk community, there's an awful lot with costumes and materials. We have some innovators too. This guy was just a guy who had 2 kids. He said every time he went to the park, he had to take a different type of play thing. So they could do something like play football this time or play baseball that time. Well, he made this ball within a ball within a ball. Okay, so the outside, when it was complete, was a soccer ball. And when you unscrew it, you can take a football out of it. When you unscrew the football, there's a baseball inside of that. And this baseball bat also converts to a golf club. He was just a guy, a maker. But because he had access to 3D printing, because he could do some milling with soft materials to do prototypes, because he could test it out on his kids and friends, he was able to turn it into a product. This is a father-daughter team who go to Boulder, Colorado every year, and they compete in what's called the racing robots. It's autonomous cars, and they just go out there, and this father-daughter team do this, that's 3 years now. 3D photography was a part of what was done there. Laser cutting is so much fun, and there's so many people doing things with it. This guy just loves doing what's called dice towers. Apparently it's what you use in Dungeons and Dragons to just roll your dice. You drop it on the top, and it goes, and it comes out the bottom. But they're so ornate, and you can just show, his handiwork, and that's a target, yeah. This is a booth that was talking about making games. Here's the rules that you define. Here's the types of things that you would need to prepare in order to create an entirely new game. So it's teaching people how to make games. You can see here in the steampunk that if some of these things are, I'm sure some of these things are purchased, but some of these things are also just made by these folks. And it's a great chance for people to hear the stories behind how they're made. This guy right here, he is getting his PhD in music or something, but what he loves to do is he takes old electronics and tries to figure out how to turn it into a musical instrument. That's what he does. So he has old Macintoshes or just old pieces of equipment that are early solid state stuff. And he just tries to figure out how can I turn this into an instrument. And he had a whole booth on just that sort of thing. This guy, I didn't know that you could get a PhD in origami. This guy, PhD in origami, he is so into this, and it's for folding and all sorts of biological development, software modeling, that sort of thing. It's really incredible. But you can see we have rockets. We have this guy made a wind tunnel. He was a teenager, I think he was about 14. Made a wind tunnel because he loved to see the way that the steam contours over objects. This was something done by High Tech High. Every student group was responsible for creating a mechanical system, making it interactive for people, and then writing a piece of poetry that was about that particular mechanical system. So here you can see a few of them, and on each of them you can see some words. That's the poems that they wrote about that particular mechanical system. And it's just wonderful what people were able to do. This is universities. These are some variants of 3D printers that people have. This lady started to make 3D printed shoes. And she's now actually got a startup, and she's moved out to Chattanooga to work in an incubator. This person was doing molding and casting. But not just traditional molding and casting. You would take objects like this bottle, and then you do software that's free to scan it. You then print a 3D model of it, and then you make a mold out of that 3D model, and then you can replicate it. So it was using some of this easy-to-use tools to create molds that was a completely different process from traditional approaches. Electric carts, this one was done by a guy who was 13 years old. Solar cooking, aquaponics systems. It's a huge ecosystem complication, but how do you make fish and light and plants and all these things balance out in a, say, area the size of these two tables? And that's the kind of thing that these people were showing off. All sorts of making, even the traditional making. These people were making yarn out of wool. Robotics groups. This is the open source Maker Labs. This is the businesses up there. We had a variety of these people, including Qualcomm and the Make Magazine folks were there. But the reason for showing you that was, even in the face of some of the worst weather going, there was tremendous turnout. And in one particular part of the floor, which I circle right here, we had placed, I very deliberately placed a lot of institutions, because making is happening at the home level. People are having fun with making, but there are also institutions that are getting into making. Libraries are getting into making. The La Jolla Library is getting 2 3D printers. The Central Library downtown already has vinyl cutters, 3D printers, etc. You have Science Museum getting into making. You have startup incubators getting into making. You have places like Fab Lab or maker spaces like I was saying. I wanted to line all these folks up side by side. Remember, the reason that I wanted to do this fair was I wanted to get people out of the woodwork to see each other's activity. And one of those goals was to get these institutions in San Diego to sit side by side and become aware of one another. Because if they become aware of one another, then maybe they'll start to share each other's ideas or their ambitions, etc., become friendly, and maybe start collaborating. And that was the goal of having all these people together. You can see libraries, science museums, schools, universities, economic development groups, all these folks side by side. And within 90 days after the event, we had all these different collaborations. So makers were exhibiting at museums in Balboa Park. I hadn't done that before. And museum executive directors kind of liked the idea of pop-up exhibits around topics that were related to their museum. Maker spaces were running library programs. There were all sorts of things that started to happen right after that. Now it's petered off because it hasn't been focused on as much, but this was one of the ambitions that we had to make happen. Because if you get these people working together, then you can start to create a community that's larger than just what's happening in this school or what's happening in this library. You can start doing more of it. Getting amateur radio more into these different groups. Maybe get more people interested in amateur radio, get more people interested in radio for programs that they're working on, like robotics, like quadcopters, like submersibles, like all these different things. There are lots of different uses, but the community needs to be aware of its other players. And the most important Maker Faire of late was that the White House held a Maker Faire on June 19th of this year. And in advance of holding that Maker Faire, the administration wanted to do a few other things as the date approached. And one of the things was, back in early May, they did something called the Mayor's Maker Challenge. It was basically challenging mayors around the country to come along and say, we'll sign up for some of these things. These are the 10 things that they asked about. A couple of them were like, run a Maker Faire, or help promote the creation of maker spaces, or have an education strategy around project-oriented learning and hands-on learning. These are the 10 things that were asked for of mayors. And at this point, there are over 100 cities around the country that have signed up, including San Diego. San Diego, a lot of cities only signed up for 1, 3, 2 different things. San Diego signed up for 9 of these things. And the reason I think that that's important to us is because I think that all this making going on, all these institutions that are trying to get back back into hands-on activity, project-based learning. The way the world has changed with these low-cost electronics, making smart tools. And the reason smart tools are really important is because it used to take so long to master a lathe. You had to spend thousands of hours of practice. It took so long to become really good at woodworking. But now with these tools, it's a lot more accessible and a lot safer. So a lot more people are getting into it and wanting to do it. And when you have something like this community of people wanting to get into making, and you have a mandate from the city to maybe make more of these things happen, it can result in an opportunity for some of the longest-toothed hardware makers, which is the amateur radio. The idea of you folks being represented at a MakerFaire is so powerful. These people are already somewhat open to the idea of working with electronics. They're open to the idea of experimenting, prototyping, trying out things. They're open to the idea of incorporating radio into what they're doing. They just need to learn from you folks what you folks already do. But it could also be another level further, which is all the things that they're doing with quadcopters and with mills and all these things. Radio could be an important differentiator. Back in my makerspace, I started a makerspace in Virginia called Nova Labs. And we kind of came to the conclusion that amateur radio is like a secret weapon to makers, because you have certain rights that your average maker doesn't have. You can do things with spectrum legally. You can experiment with license. This is a really, really wonderful capability. I got to tell you, most makers, they're oblivious of it. So there's one thing to get them into the hobby, which is fantastic. There's another thing, which is if we figured out how to make our hobby more relevant to them, then it provides a great opportunity to bring young blood in, to sort of increase membership, to show the importance of this in new ways. And so I wanted to give you all that backdrop because you kind of have to understand what's going on out there before you can appreciate how important amateur radio can be in this context. And to tell you that right now, we do not have a fair this year. And the reason for that was we're working very hard, and have now for 14 months, to work it out with Balboa PARC, such that during their centennial, we'll have a 2-day MakerFaire later in the year. We actually have a lot of details worked out, just not free to divulge them yet, but you can count on, and I don't know how you folks feel about Balboa PARC. I'm a huge Central Park in New York, and any major park that is full of cultural institutions and so much diversity of ideas, that place is just fantastic. So I think it's a really great thing. You can have everything from science museums to air and space, automotive, to natural history, museum of man, so many different ways that making can be sort of exhibited, and you can give great examples for what man has done with making over time and what they're doing today. And I'd love to be able to figure out how we can really get something special happen with amateur radio there. So we've got quite a few months, not almost a year to figure it out. If you folks were interested in exhibiting the way you normally do, it would be great, because makers need to learn about this. Maybe in the Science Museum, maybe in one of the other museums, because they need to hear more about this. But if there was a way to figure out how amateur radio actually helps them take the stuff they're doing now to another level, then that's even more exciting. And that could be good for making around the country. So I wanted to just give you that background. I really appreciate the opportunity that you've given me to give this background. Happy to take a few questions, because you've got 2 minutes before we're supposed to be done.
Did you
Yes.
say that there's not going to be a fair this year?
No, we've been working with, no, there's not going to be one in 2014. 2015, yes. We've been working with Orange County and with Inland Empire. Lots of schools, and he has lots of makers. We're actually putting in something like 40 makers to help fill out the floor. And then he also has vendors there. It is making for education, and ours is making for just the joy of making. That's kind of what MakerFaire is. It's kind of a celebration of making, and everybody just brings whatever they're proud about. They come and exhibit for free, and it's just a great event. There was another question back there? Yes?
Where do you find information as to what has been developed as part of open source?
It's a really, really big question, but let me just tell you a good example of it.
It's 9 o'clock.
It's 9 o'clock. So Arduino is this board that's very, very popular. It's an open source board. People can redesign it, extend it, change it, whatever they want. And it uses a certain processor, and there's a huge community developing for it. A lot of the code that supports that board for different actuators and sensors is on Arduino.cc. So that's the primary repository for the most popular board being used in the Arduino, in the open hardware movement. Something else I want to tell you. Oh, since we're talking about URLs, so we're in San Diego County. We're talking about MakerFaire, and ours was called a mini MakerFaire. So the reason I did that was it's SD, the URL, San Diego mini MakerFaire, sdmmf.org. And so that's where you'd find out what's going on. That's where you can get onto the distribution list, etc. But as I particularly care about the amateur radio community in the maker movement, I don't plan on, I'm not going to rely on you folks to just sort of pay attention to what we put on our website. I want to be in touch with you folks and working with you folks to maybe see if we can do something special in Balboa Park over the course of 2 days during their centennial, 100-year celebration. Yes?
Do you have a working date that you're not releasing?
Yes. I mean, it's locked, but I can't say it yet.
What's the working date? So we can kind of do some
I'll tell you afterwards.
Okay.
Sorry, folks, it's like contract's not signed, and I'm not supposed to divulge it publicly yet. Other questions? One more question, come on. Yes?
Have you checked to see what the weather is supposed to be that time of the year?
Farmer's Almanac.
Very good. No, we moved it earlier, and it's much, much safer. So thank you for your concern. Anything else? All right, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming out to the club tonight, giving that presentation. Let us know what we can do to help out and have fun with you. Okay.